Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. I'm coming to you again from Hinokicho Park, where it's a rather chilly late morning, but not as cold as it's been here for the last few days. When I come out here recently to walk my dog in the morning, the grass is covered with frost and there's a lot of ice on the sidewalks, and yesterday morning the pond here was completely frozen over. And it's not unusual to have cold weather in the winter in Tokyo, of course, but it is a little unusual to have it this early. Normally we don't begin to see the ice and frost until the middle of January or so. But the day is not so bad, so I decided to come out and try to make a couple of videos. The subject of my first video today is going to be another Olympus medium format camera, an Olympus 6 camera. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras in my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I also sell these at my Etsy store, which is also called Japan Vintage Camera, and I have an eBay store as well. So if you'd like to purchase this camera or another vintage Japanese camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. So the Olympus 6 was made in several different variations over the years. It was introduced in 1948 or so, and production ended in 1955. There were 4 numbered variations, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, and after the number 4 ended, Olympus produced what was called the R2, which was this particular model here. The early versions were very simple cameras, a very simple, pretty much just I guess a film chamber, a lens on a bellows, a mechanical shutter, and a knob to wind the film, and a film counter window on the back, and that was pretty much all to them. But they were really high quality cameras with a really good lens, and because of the quality of the photographs they produced, they became quite popular. And they became so popular that Olympus thought that these would continue to be, I guess, good sellers for a number of years. And in the early 1950s, Olympus began casting a large number of camera bodies and parts to produce these for quite some time. But unfortunately, at this time, 35mm film was beginning to catch on, and by the time 1954 or so rolled about, I guess the writing was on the wall, signifying the end of the popularity of the 6x6 format. So Olympus took the remaining bodies and parts they had, and they made some improvements in the cameras to try to make them more marketable, so they could kind of just get rid of this extra stock of parts. The first attempt at this new version was the Olympus 4A and 4B, and I made a video about the 4B previously. You can see that if you take a look at the videos on my channel. And then after that, the R2 series was released. These cameras were much more technologically advanced than the previous 1, 2, and 3 series, and had a number of really interesting improvements. So let's go ahead and take a look at the features, functions, and controls of the Olympus 6 R2A. We'll go ahead and start at the top as usual. And the first thing we notice on this particular camera is it has this little window on the side here, which is actually a frame counter window, which works, I guess, much more easily than the earlier style system with the windows on the back. Of course, this one also has these. The frame counter only works in the 6x6 format and not in the 6x45 format. And you kind of still need the windows here when you are loading film in the camera. Next to that, we have a button on the top. And this is actually not a button which you push down, but a lever which you push forward. And what this does is allows you to release the film winding mechanism to move on to the next exposure. Under my thumb here, you can see the film winding lever, and you have to operate this lever anywhere between 6 and 8 times to wind the film, depending on how far of the way you are through the film. It automatically stops at the next frame, and once it stops, you can take the photograph, reset the lever, and then wind on to the next frame. The next thing we have here is the button which you depress to open the front of the camera and expose the lens and shutter. Next to that, we have a shoe for mounting a flash gun. When you mount a flash on this gun, you're going to need a flash which uses the Kodak style flash socket. This doesn't use the later style PC socket, so you'll have to get an adapter if you're going to run a more modern flash with it. Over to the right here, we have the shutter release button, and it has kind of a small threaded collar around here, so you can attach a cable release adapter to it. On the back of the camera here, of course, we have the film winding lever, which I already showed. Here we have the viewfinder window, and this camera is kind of interesting with the viewfinder in that it has a selector switch, which you can use to switch between the 6x6 and 6x4 formats. And when you move this switch, there are masks which move on the front of the viewfinder. You can kind of see it move there as I switch the lever. And this allows you to get the proper field of view for whichever format you happen to be shooting in. Next to that on the back we have the focusing dial for the rangefinder. Now this camera, like the earlier Olympus 4A and B, does not have a coupled rangefinder. What you have to do is look through the viewfinder and then focus using the knob, and once the split image is lined up, you look at the number indicated on the dial here, and you select the same number by turning the front of the lens, like so. And once that's done, the camera is in focus, then you can charge the shutter and compose and shoot. Moving to the back here, once again, we have the film counter windows. When you are loading film into the cameras, if you're using the mechanical film counter, of course, you have to wind the lever until the red number 1 shows up in the window. And also wind the film so the number 1 shows up in the 6x6 window on the back of the camera. And once it's set up, you can push up the lever here and simply wind the the winding lever until it stops, and then the camera is ready to shoot. If you're shooting the 6x4 format, you still have to continue using the numbers on the back of the film. On the bottom of the camera, we have a standard 1/4 inch tripod socket. We also have the knobs, which you have to pull when you are putting in a roll of film or changing the take-up spool. The important features and functions are, of course, located on the lens. At the very rear of the lens, we have a tab here, which has teeth on it so you can easily grasp it. And this is for selecting the aperture. This being the A version, has 75mm f3.5 lens. The B version came with the 75mm f2.8 lens. Otherwise, the cameras are identical. In front of that, of course, you have the flash adapter socket. And in front of that, you have the shutter charging lever. And in front of the shutter charging lever, you have the shutter speed selection ring. Now this camera here features a bulb setting as well as settings from 1 second through 1/200th of a second. Some variations of this camera came with a 1/300th second shutter speed. On the bottom here you have a self-timer, which is quite an interesting feature. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the very front here is the focusing ring. Now these cameras, despite their rather, antiquated design, are actually quite amazing performers, and they are capable of taking, pictures of quite amazing resolution, especially compared to digital and 35mm film. And in recent years, the medium format cameras have made quite a comeback for the people who are interested in kind of the retro photography, and also for the quality of the images which these cameras can produce. These are quite simple cameras. There isn't really much to them, and there isn't really much which can go wrong with them, which is why, I don't know, 65 years later, 55 years later, they're still in good working condition. I'll go ahead and next show you how to load film in the camera. The first thing you have to do is open the rear film door. There's a latch located on the top left side. You simply push that upward. The film door pops open. Depending on what kind of camera you have, where you put the take-up spool in the film varies. Some cameras have the take-up spool on the right side, some have on the left side. The Olympus 6 is located on the left side. To load film in the camera, you would put your roll of 120 film here. And to seat it down, you have to, of course, pull up on the knob here until the roll of film slides down. Then you release this, and then make sure that the roll of film is properly seated and centered. Then you would pull the roll of film, or I guess the paper backing, over the back of the lens. What I do when I am doing this is the end of the paper I kind of fold and I make a sharp crease by pressing it between my thumb and finger so it has like a nice 90-degree edge. And when I put it in the take-up spool, the take-up spool kind of grips the paper better. One problem that people who are just starting with medium format have with 120 roll film is often when they are trying to wind the take-up spool, the paper keeps popping out, and you have to kind of play around with it a couple of times before you finally get it inside. Another thing which helps to get it inside correctly is to kind of push down with your thumb and kind of help it around and keep pushing down on it, and pretty soon it'll be seated nice and tightly and the film will wind properly. What you need to do next is continue pulling the film across or winding it until the arrow, which goes across the back of the paper, ends up more or less in the center of the film plane here. And once it's centered, you can close the back of the door. And if you're using, say, the 6x4/5 format, simply wind the film until the number 1 shows up in the window. If you're using the 6x6 format, wind until number 1 shows up in this window, and with the red number 1 showing up on the film counter, then release the film counter and simply wind it until the lever stops and the camera is ready to shoot. When you are shooting, simply open up the camera, focus on your subject using the focusing wheel on the back, set the focus here on your lens, then you will set your shutter speed and aperture, charge the shutter, then focus and shoot. That's pretty much all there is to it. When you are shopping for one of these cameras, one thing to always look out for on these old Olympus 6s is to make sure that the lens doesn't have any haze in it. A problem which these cameras often have is a kind of permanent haze which etches into the glass, and it can happen on the front and rear elements, or front or rear elements. Sometimes it gets one, sometimes it gets the other, sometimes it gets both, sometimes it doesn't affect them at all. This one doesn't have any haze on it, so it's one of the good examples. Another thing to look for in these Olympus 6s is to make sure that it still has the mask for the 6x45 format. This is handy if you want to shoot in both formats. If you're in 6x6, you end up with a square format, kind of like an Instagram format, but if you want to shoot like landscapes or things like that, the 645 adapter comes in quite handy. You simply hold the camera sideways to get a nice, I guess, 6x4/5 horizontal landscape type format. And it's also good for shooting portraits with the 6x4/5 format. But recently the 6x6 format seems to be much more popular. Anyway, that's it for my video about the Olympus R2A. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more videos about vintage Japanese cameras, I'll be posting more of these in the future. I have quite a few more cameras which I've received, which I haven't done videos about, and I'll be putting those up as quickly as I can. Once again, I'll have this camera for sale shortly in my online stores. If you'd like to buy it, please check out my stores. If you like the video, please punch the like button. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.